The respiratory system. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the function of the respiratory system. The primary function, of course, is to exchange oxygen, bring in oxygen from the air to the blood. So oxygen should enter in exchange for CO2, carbon dioxide, which is coming from the body or the blood. We want it to exit. All right, now breathing or ventilation, it has two parts: inspiration or inhaling and expiration. Inhaling conducts air towards the lungs, expiration conducts air away from the lungs. The cardiovascular system and respiratory system work together to accomplish this exchange. Now, the exchange of gases, oxygen and CO2, between air and blood is referred to as the external respiration, because this is an exchange with the external environment. Now, of course, there's transportation of gases to and from the lungs and to tissues. And ultimately, that's where the cardiovascular system, part of the cardiovascular system's primary job is to deliver oxygen to all of the tissues and cells in your body and take away carbon dioxide so that it can be exchanged in the respiratory system. All right, next. So when this happens, when the exchange of gases occurs between blood and tissue, this is referred to as the internal respiration. All right, so we have external respiration, internal respiration. Now let's look at the anatomy. Okay, so we have a upper and lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract is going to be the nose, which is a pathway for air, the mouth, which is a pathway for air, the nasal cavity. So this whole cavity right here is the nasal cavity. Its job is to filter, warm, and moisten the air that's coming in. And then we have the pharynx right here. So air will move this way. And the pharynx is your throat. It's a pathway for air, food, and liquid. And especially, well, for the respiratory system, it's going to be air. Okay, then we have the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is this little tiny flap that can open and close. Now, remember from the digestive system, the epiglottis closes so that food doesn't move into the trachea, right? Or else you would choke. Of course, during respiration, it's going to be open, and the pathway will go on into the lower respiratory tract and move to the larynx. The larynx is your voice box. It produces sound. Okay, and that leads to the trachea, which is the primary airway. And the trachea branches off into two branches into each lung. Those branches are called the bronchus or bronchi. And the bronchi, each bronchi will branch further off into bronchioles. That's these little branches. So the big, thick branches, bronchus, the little ones are the bronchi. Of course, we have the right lung, the left lung, and notice how each lung is protected by a membrane called the pleural membrane. It encases each lung. All right, now the lungs are the organ of gas exchange, because inside of the lung tissue we have something called the alveoli. The alveoli are air sacs where gas exchange actually occurs. Okay, and see the ribs here. Now in between each rib we have the intercostal muscles, which have a vital role in respiration. And underneath all of this we have the diaphragm. The diaphragm is this thin layer of muscle, and it is essential for breathing. Okay, The upper respiratory tract functions, acts as a pathway for respiration, filters larger foreign material, and moistens and warms all of the incoming air, because of course we cannot have dry air, nor can it be too cold as it comes into the lungs and then eventually the blood. Now if we look closely here, let's start over here actually. Of course, we have our nasal cavity, the pharynx, so air is going to move through here, pass through the pharynx, and then it's actually going to pass through one more organ that I haven't discussed. It's called the glottis, and it's just this little, the glottis is right underneath the epiglottis, and the epiglottis stays open during respiration. Okay, then of course we have that larynx right there. Now, the purpose of this diagram is really to show a deeper look into the alveoli. So, of course, like I said, the trachea branches off, okay, into two bronchus, right and left. Then these are the bronchioles, which are the small branches, and these bronchioles, they dead end. So if we follow this one, they're going to dead end into alveoli. Now this is the alveoli blown up, and you'll see there's a bronchiole, and then it branches into these alveoli, and there are these little clusters of air sacs. And notice that they have it cut open here, so you could see that it's full of air. And notice that it's encapsulated with a capillary network. So there is a direct connection to all of the alveoli. These are the pulmonary veins. So of course, CO2 rich blood will come through this side, the venous side, and in the alveoli, gases exchange, which I will show in closer detail. CO2 is released out of the blood into the alveoli, and O2 is going to enter the blood. So the gas exchange is happening in this network, in this whole network, and we'll look at it in more detail as we go through. But that is an important factor to point out right away. All right, now the lower respiratory tract functions. Now look closely at this picture. The larynx is easily recognizable by its shape. Kind of has this cup-like shape, and then we have our trachea. Okay. Now the trachea, well, let me go over the larynx first. So of course it's an airway. It also can act as a route for food too in the digestive system, and it's your voice box. So it has a job or a role in sound production. Okay, the trachea acts as a transporter of air to the lungs. And then, of course, the bronchi branch into the lungs. The lungs actually transport air to the alveoli for gas exchange. Now, the trachea itself is pretty sophisticated. It's made up of a layer of epithelial tissue, connective tissue, and smooth muscle tissue, and cartilaginous rings. We've discussed this before, however, quickly, one of our defense mechanisms with the respiratory system is the fact that your trachea is lined with cilia. So this is a close view of cilia, and of course there's mucus there as well, and the job of the mucus and cilia is to trap microorganisms, and then the cilia will sweep and push this combination of mucus, debris, microorganisms out of the respiratory tract. And of course, smoking actually paralyzes cilia and damages cilia, and it leads to a cough reflex. Now, basically, this is one of the worst case scenarios, and it's hard to see it under the microscope. Hard to see it because it's black and white, but this is the cilia under the microscope, and you can see that it's very damaged versus, if you look very close right here, like this is undamaged versus all of this is completely damaged. That means that smokers do not have a line of defense towards the lungs. And the lungs, the pathway to the lungs is a one-way pathway. Okay, now the lungs are the organ of gas exchange, and they're surrounded by the pleural membrane. And again, the bronchioles terminate into the clusters of alveoli. Okay, now I want to point out a couple of things here. Now, the right lung has 3 lobes. 1, 2, 3. And the left lung has 2 lobes. 1, 2. And then there's the diaphragm. And you'll see the heart is right there. Okay. The alveoli. So of course the lungs are organs of gas exchange, but more specifically it's the tissue, the alveoli tissue, that is directly involved. So we have small pulmonary veins, small pulmonary arteries, and pulmonary capillary networks that are involved in the direct exchange of CO2 and O2. So, as I mentioned, the bronchioles end in these clusters of alveoli. There's a bronchiole ending in the cluster of alveoli. And it almost looks like a mesh network of capillaries surrounding every single alveoli cluster. And CO2 and O2 are exchanged across the capillary and alveoli walls by diffusion. So what's happening here is CO2 from the blood is going to leave the blood by diffusion and enter the alveoli, and eventually this will get exhaled out. And at the same time, following the laws of diffusion, oxygen will diffuse into the blood from the alveoli into the blood, and this blood will go to the heart, of course. It'll go to the heart and into the body. So it's going into the body. When a person breathes, there's a pressure gradient involved, and it's a 3-step process that we don't really think about, but it's an important process that has to be absolutely perfect, because failure if there's a glitch or any failure in any of these steps can lead to death. Okay, so here we go. Now, remember the external intercostal muscles, okay, the muscles between each rib, and the diaphragm. So the diaphragm in the relaxed state is dome-shaped, okay, and when you inhale, air is going to flow inwards, of course, and the diaphragm is going to contract downwards. And at the same time, these muscles will contract and the ribs will move upwards and those muscles will contract. Then when you exhale, okay, air is out. The diaphragm returns to this dome-like shape, which is the diaphragm in a relaxed state. And then the intercostal muscles, of course, will rest, and so will the ribs. Okay, now this is absolutely essential for this to work perfectly. In fact, there is, in the past, there has been biological warfare that has been designed to block the contraction of the diaphragm. And basically kill the enemy. And actually, that it's Botox. What we know now today as Botox would stop this contracting. And if you can't contract that diaphragm, then that's basically a death sentence. You can't breathe. You can't breathe. You can't survive. And initially, the drug that we now know as Botox was designed as warfare, biological war. I don't know how you spell warfare. Okay, warfare. I think I'm spelling that right. There we go. Yeah. All right. So it was designed as biological warfare because what does Botox do? It paralyzes the muscles. It stops the contraction of muscles. And then, of course, I can't say if it was used or not. I don't know. But that's why it was designed. And then eventually, Botox is a bacteria. Eventually, it was used in cosmetics because they realized that they could stop the relaxation of muscles in the face and thus preventing or reducing the appearance of wrinkles. All right, that's just a kind of fun little side note and emphasizing the importance of the diaphragm, essential. All right, now you can go through this on your own. It's just basically reiterating the steps of what I just discussed in the previous slide. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is lung volume, vital capacity measures of the lung, which measure the lung function. So what this is basically is as follows. Okay, so we can measure whether or not the lungs are working the way that they're supposed to because we have machinery designed to do so. And this is how it's done. So we have something called tidal volume and vital capacity. Okay, vital capacity first is the maximum volume that you're able to move in and out in one breath. And of course, being ill can affect this. Okay. Now, tidal volume is the amount of air inhaled and exhaled between each breath. So if we look at this, so this is a little reader, so we can actually do this test in the lab. Very simple. Okay, it's called a spirometer, and it measures lung volume, and that's what this little boy is doing here with this doctor. And okay, so this is what's going on. He is taking normal breaths, normal, inhale, exhale, that's normal. And it should be about 500 mils of normal breathing, right? Now, no, I'm sorry, that should say 5,000 mils. Okay, now when you take a incredibly large breath and you inhale as hard as you possibly can, and then exhale as hard as you possibly can. Okay, we should be able to see this perfect measurement. Okay, inhaling is the inspiratory reservoir. Exhale is the expiratory reservoir. And then we go back to tidal volume. Someone with emphysema, okay, is going to have some issues here. So we're showing the emphysema in orange. Notice that they cannot quite get all the way up as quickly, because we're measuring over time, as quickly as a normal person, and actually it doesn't get all the way up there at all. And it takes a longer amount of time to complete that one huge inhale, exhale. So it's easy to detect emphysema. Of course, emphysema is caused from smoking. Okay, now when gas is exchanged and the transportation that occurs within the body, this exchange occurs naturally. It occurs passively, okay, by means of diffusion. Now, if you remember diffusion, molecules move down their gradient. And in this case, we're talking about gas. And so for gases, when we're talking about gases, we refer to a term called partial pressure. Partial pressure is the pressure that is exerted by one gas in a mixture of gases. So in other words, there's not just one gas that's there. There's a mixture of gases, and we can measure how much oxygen by measuring the partial pressure of that oxygen in the mix. We can measure the partial pressure of CO2 in the mixture. And ultimately, the partial pressure of a gas is proportionate to the percentage of the total gas composition. Right. So it's simple. It sounds very technical, but it's not. Let's just pretend that this is a balloon. It's not a great balloon, but it should suffice. Okay, the balloon's full of gases like oxygen, gas, and CO2 gas. Now that's a mixture of gases, okay? And together they're going to be, all of the gas mixed together is a total gas composition, but we can measure the partial pressure of each gas, and gas will always diffuse down its partial pressure gradient from a region of high to a region of low partial pressure. So the same concept of diffusion is applied here, except we're talking about gases. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the alveoli, okay, and it's just showing us a part of the alveoli, and an artery, a small artery, the arteriole. This is a pulmonary artery. And ultimately, what we're seeing is that, remember, gases move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So here's oxygen. The concentration of oxygen is going to be high. And so therefore, oxygen is going to diffuse down its partial pressure gradient from a region of high concentration to a region of low. So some of it will sit or just stay in the blood plasma, but most of the most of the oxygen will interact with red blood cells. So here is a red blood cell, and now remember, this protein hemoglobin, its job is to interact with and carry oxygen. Okay, so when oxygen meets hemoglobin, it actually makes this temporary compound called oxyhemoglobin, and this is how oxygen is transported in the blood until it's time to deliver it. Okay, now what we're looking at here is how CO2 leaves by diffusion. So these are your tissue cells. Okay, up here, tissue, and CO2 in the tissue is going to be high. Therefore, it's going to follow the laws of diffusion because, in other words, it's high in the tissue and low in the blood. And we need that CO2 out because it's a waste product. And so CO2 will diffuse down its concentration gradient, and it actually is transported by red blood cells as well. And ultimately what happens here is it interacts with a water molecule, and it will make this compound called bicarbonate. So every CO2 will temporarily make an H2CO3, and then one hydrogen ion will disconnect over here. And that's important to see this hydrogen ion concentration, because it actually gives the body a measurement of how much CO2 is really in the blood. And bicarbonate, so CO2 doesn't just travel as CO2, it travels as bicarbonate. And some of it will interact with hemoglobin, and some will stay in the plasma. Okay, so this is the transport of CO2 out of the tissues into your veins, the venous system. Now, how do we know, how does the body know how to control breathing? Well, of course, just like everything else, it's controlled by the brain. And we have a respiratory center in your medulla oblongata, which controls your breathing patterns. So it regulates breathing patterns, and it will release impulses every 4 to 5 seconds, stimulating the intercostal muscles to contract, relax, and along with the diaphragm. And so your nervous system regulates breathing. Remember, the nervous system is the boss of all of the systems. So how does the body know how fast or how much, how heavy to breathe? Because we have receptors. We can monitor CO2 and hydrogen ion, and we can measure hydrogen ion, remember, matters or counts because of the fact that CO2 is transported as bicarbonate, which releases one hydrogen ion in this reaction. Okay, so that was the significant factor with that. Now we have receptors that monitor CO2 and hydrogen ion levels in the blood, and if they're too high, then of course the respiratory system is going to be signaled by the nervous system to increase the respiratory rate. Okay. In turn, oxygen is monitored. We have something called aortic and choroidal bodies that monitor oxygen in the blood. And if oxygen is too low, that is not going to be okay at all. Immediately, the brain and the nervous system is going to cause the respiratory system to increase the rate and depth of your breathing. So everything is incredibly sophisticated and organized in the body. Now let's take a look at the nervous system. Okay, so we're going to learn the nervous system in incredible detail, but here I want to point out a couple of important factors. Number one, the receptors near the respiratory, we have a respiratory center in the medulla, and in the medulla there are receptors that receive signals, okay, and ultimately there's the medulla. And these little lines and arrows are demonstrating that the medulla will send signals down to the intercostal muscles and down to the diaphragm to increase breathing when necessary. Now notice this. When we're measuring oxygen, and what measures oxygen is these aortic bodies. It's these little bodies that are on top of the aorta. So blood coming right out of the lungs, remember, goes into the left atrium, then left ventricle, then the aorta, then the body. And so this is a perfect place to measure oxygen and make sure that the oxygen levels are perfect. And then we have two major arteries that go up to the brain called the carotid arteries. And on those arteries, we have the carotid bodies that also measure oxygen rates, and they signal to the medulla the measurement of oxygen, and it will decide if it needs to do anything about it, if it needs to increase. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. Okay, so that is in short the respiratory system, and we're going to I'm going to show a video after I quickly look over the disorders of the respiratory system or review them with you. Okay, so these are pretty interesting. Pharyngitis, well, itis means inflammation. Pharyngitis means inflammation of the pharynx, and that's one example is strep throat. Bronchitis, well, bronchitis is no fun at all, but bronchitis is inflammation of the bronchi or bronchus, and ultimately, there's acute and chronic, but the fact is that the airways get filled with mucus, and a person has to be treated by a doctor for something like this, and actually pharyngitis as well. Cystic fibrosis. We've discussed a little bit of cystic fibrosis in the past. This is a genetic disorder, and remember, cystic fibrosis, it completely impedes the airways because people with cystic fibrosis develop this thick mucus in their bronchus and in their, it's really in the bronchus, and it blocks the airway to the lung. So it impedes the airway to the lung, and therefore a person with cystic fibrosis constantly has low levels of oxygen, and they're susceptible to pulmonary infections, and almost every single organ system is affected. So they have a pretty difficult life. Now, tuberculosis is a bacterial infection. Usually, depending on what you do for a living, or if you're going to work in the medical field, everybody ends up having to get a TB test at some point. And it's pretty straightforward. They just test for the bacteria to see if it's there or not. And ultimately, there's a skin test, and then if the skin test doesn't work out, they can test a chest x-ray. The good thing about bacterial infections is that they're treatable with antibiotics. Okay, next is the video, and it's incredibly important, so keep watching.
When we talk about respiration, we are referring to the processes that are involved in the exchange of gases. In our bodies, gas exchange occurs not only between our lungs and the atmosphere, but also between the blood and tissues of the body. The exchange of gases with the atmosphere is referred to as external respiration, because gases enter and leave from the environment outside the body. The exchange of gases between the blood and tissues is called internal respiration, because gas exchange happens between the cells internally. To better understand these processes, we are going to follow the flow of gases in a normal breathing cycle and examine what happens to both carbon dioxide and oxygen as you breathe in and out. As you take in a breath, oxygen-rich air enters the tiny air sacs, or alveoli, in the lungs. Each of these alveoli is surrounded by tiny capillaries. In the capillaries, the red blood cells, or RBCs, are returning from the tissues of the body where they have dropped off their previous supply of oxygen. Therefore, the partial pressure of oxygen in the RBC is lower than that in the alveoli. Note that partial pressure is a way of discussing the concentration of gases, and with regards to diffusion, you can treat partial pressure the same way that you treat any other concentration difference. Back in the RBC, the difference in partial pressure causes the oxygen to diffuse from the alveoli into the plasma of the capillaries, and then into the RBC. Once in the RBC, the oxygen binds the hemoglobin, forming an oxyhemoglobin. The oxygen-rich RBCs then return to the heart by way of the pulmonary vein. They are then transported using the systemic circuit of the circulatory system to the tissues of the body. Once the RBC reaches the tissues, internal respiration begins. The partial pressure of oxygen in the RBC is higher than that of the surrounding tissues, which are using oxygen for cellular respiration. The oxygen therefore diffuses from the hemoglobin, out of the capillaries, and into the cells of the body. How does the body direct oxygen to cells that need it? Let's compare two cells, a muscle cell and an adipose or fat cell. The muscle cell is more metabolically active than the adipose cell, and therefore uses oxygen at a greater rate. This creates a steeper concentration gradient between the muscle cell and the RBCs than between the adipose cell and the RBCs. As a result, more oxygen is delivered to the muscle cell than to the adipose cell. Now let's follow the transport of carbon dioxide gas, starting with the RBC that just dropped off the oxygen to the cells. At about the same time as the oxygen is diffusing outward, carbon dioxide diffuses into the RBC. However, unlike oxygen, which was largely transported by hemoglobin, most of the carbon dioxide gas is transported within the cytoplasm of the RBC. While a small amount does bind to hemoglobin, forming carbaminohemoglobin, most forms carbonic acid, H2CO3, the same chemical found in soda. The carbonic acid breaks down quickly into bicarbonate ions, HCO3-, and hydrogen ions, H+. Bicarbonate is the major transport form of carbon dioxide in the blood. Once again, this is referred to as internal respiration, since it's occurring between the tissues and the RBCs. The systemic circuit returns the carbon dioxide-rich RBCs to the heart. From here, they are sent onto the lungs via the pulmonary artery. At the lungs, the gas exchange process is basically reversed. Bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions combine to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is broken down by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, forming carbon dioxide gas and some water. The carbon dioxide gas then diffuses out of the RBCs, across the capillaries, and into the alveoli, from where it is eventually exhaled into the atmosphere. Notice that both internal and external respiration largely rely on the process of diffusion.
Fresh air entering the lung carries oxygen with a partial pressure of oxygen, or PO2, of 160. Moisture in the lung alveolus reduces the partial pressure of oxygen to 104. Fresh air entering the lung carries carbon dioxide with a partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or PCO2, of 0.3. Carbon dioxide carried to the lung by the blood raises the partial pressure of carbon dioxide to 40. At the arterial ends of the pulmonary capillaries, oxygen diffuses from the air in the alveoli into the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli because of differences in partial pressures. At the venous ends of the pulmonary capillaries, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is equal to the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is equal to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli. The exchange of these gases were a result of simple diffusion. With no differences in partial pressure remaining, there is no more net movement of oxygen or carbon dioxide. Oxygen diffuses out of the arterial ends of tissue capillaries into the tissue fluid, then into the cells, and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cells into the tissue fluid, then into the blood, because of differences in partial pressures. At the venous ends of the tissue capillaries, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is equal to the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissue fluid, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is equal to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissue fluid. As a result, no more net movement of oxygen or carbon dioxide occurs. The blood now carries the oxygen and carbon dioxide to the lungs. In the body, all of these exchanges of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs, the bloodstream, and the tissues occur simultaneously.